CASAT Podcast Network.
Welcome to Season 2 of CASAT Conversations. I am your host, Heather Haslam. This season, we will explore the timely and complex topic of resilience for healthcare providers. Within each conversation, you will hear from experts, clinicians, and providers who will explore and share the latest research, best practices, and applications for how to be resilient. Please enjoy today's conversation. We are excited to welcome Dr. Dana Rose Garfin to CASAT Conversations today. Dr. Garfin is faculty in the Sue and Bill Gross School of Nursing and the program in Public Health at the University of California, Irvine. Her academic work explores how individual-level negative life events and collective trauma affect physical and mental health across the lifespan, and how community-based interventions can alleviate resulting health disparities. She is currently the principal investigator of an NIH-funded KO1 mindfulness-based intervention to address PTSD in trauma-exposed homeless women, which uses a biopsychosocial approach to examine how mindfulness can help reduce PTSD, depression, substance abuse, and improve regulation of the HPA axis. She is also co-PI of several National Science Foundation grants that examine how individuals respond and adapt to collective trauma, including hurricanes and COVID-19. Her work has been covered in hundreds of domestic and international media outlets, and her 2020 paper on COVID-19 was the third most downloaded article across 89 journals of the American Psychological Association. In 2021, she was awarded the Outstanding Contribution to Trauma Psychology by an Early Career Psychologist Award by the American Psychological Association. Dana graduated summa cum laude from the University of Colorado Boulder with a BA in sociology. She has a master's in social ecology and a Ph.D. in psychology and social behavior from the University of California, Irvine. Welcome, Dr. Garfin. We are so happy to have you on CASAT Conversations today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I'd love to hear how you got into this work and all of the research that you've done to date.
So I got interested in this work when I was at the University of Colorado Boulder as an undergraduate. I was a sociology and political science major. So I was very interested in the way large-scale events and social structures influence the way people think and behave. And so after college, I became more interested in sort of the micro level of human feelings, thoughts, cognitions, behaviors. And so then I worked at a research lab at Stanford University on mood and anxiety disorders. And I, for my graduate work, wanted to combine those interests. So understanding the psychology of how individuals respond to large-scale collective trauma was a really natural synergy of those various interests.
Awesome. So with that, what have you learned about how people are responding to COVID-19?
So COVID-19 is, not to use an overused word, but it truly is an unprecedented event. And that's because it's happening at multiple levels of exposure. So it's an acute event in that this kind of ongoing event is punctured with these sort of acute traumatic events. Like you might get sick. You might know someone that's sick. There's a stay-at-home order implemented. Schools are closed. There has been a lot of political tension. And so there's these kind of, acute events that are occurring under the umbrella of this long and protracted chronic stressor, right? So we sort of have two things occurring at the same time. Another thing that really makes the COVID-19 pandemic unique is that people are exposed to it directly in their individual lives, as well as through media exposure. So people have had a lot of media exposure to the events of 2020 and of course 2021 as well, both with COVID-19 as well as all these kind of associated stressors that occurred, economic problems, stay at home, school closures, political upheaval, social upheaval. So all these things have been happening in tandem and synergistically and related to each other. And so that's really put a strain on people's mental health.
And what has your research found is the psychological impact of COVID-19?
So for the psychological impact of COVID-19, the research that I've done along with a lot of other folks, there's been, quite a lot of research on the psychological impacts of COVID-19. So a few things. First of all, people have reported elevated distress. So we know that people are reporting more anxiety, they're reporting more depression, they're reporting higher levels of stress. And so we definitely have seen that. But another thing that I think it's important to point out is that people are quite resilient. And so even though a lot of people are reporting these sort of negative mental health consequences, we also see a lot of people that are quite resilient and able to adapt. And so I think that there's something that, we can kind of honor and learn from that side of the coin as well.
Yeah. And I'm curious, a lot of your research has also focused on the positive impacts of COVID-19 and really that resilience and our ability to adapt. Can you say more about that and what you found?
Yeah, so I would say two things. So first of all, when we talk about the positive impacts, it's not an either or, right? So, and a lot of research on stress and trauma has found that when you think about people finding positive experiences in traumatic events, that actually happens co-occurring with psychological distress. So there's a lot of research that, when a negative event happens, people try to search for the positive, they try to make sense of it, they try to find meaning. And so, saying that people are able to find positive benefits doesn't at all negate the stress and the psychological discomfort and the trauma that people have experienced. So, it's definitely, again, it's not like an either or, it really can happen in tandem, even for the same person. And so what our research has found is that people have been able to report positive benefits. A lot of people, there's been a lot of anecdotal reports as well. People reported they enjoyed slowing down. They enjoyed spending time with their family. They had a reprioritization of what's important, feelings of increased gratitude. So, there has been an ability of people to kind of see the silver lining, so to speak, even in unfortunate circumstances.
And what are some of the coping mechanisms that you've seen that have been supportive for people during this time?
So a lot of people have reported spending more time outdoors. They've been engaged with hobbies. They have, again, felt kind of even more connected with some of the people that they are able to interact with. So we do have these kind of positive benefits that people experience. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not experiencing distress. And in some cases, they can actually report increased positive benefits at the same time that they're reporting an increased stress response compared to other people.
Yeah, as we explore the topic of resilience, one of the things we keep coming across is the complexity. And that's really what you're pointing towards here, right? Like it's not an either or, there's really an and. I can be experiencing distress, and in the same moment, I might be experiencing gratitude. Yeah,
exactly. And indeed, I think from the experience of adversity, sometimes those experiences can arise. Right. It's like when you're confronted with this loss, it can sometimes make you look at your life and think, what is here that's good? Right. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Right. I mean, like that's very like adaptive, right? Coping strategy. It's not adaptive to have something negative happen and just lay in bed all day for the rest of your life. Even if it's something that's so overwhelming, that would even make sense. Right. So, it's adaptive to kind of be able to look at the pieces of one's life when things have fallen apart and think, how can I move forward? what do I need to do? What do I need to focus on, to be able to be resilient and to be able to deal with these negative life events in a positive way and be able to move forward. But, again, I just think it's really important. And I think, a lot of people have talked about sort of toxic positivity. So I just want to be clear that that's not at all what we're talking about here, right? And in fact, I think it's really important that people honor their grief and honor their distress and are aware of their anxiety, depression, anger. That's actually can open the door for healing, right? So, you feel anxiety, right? Anxiety about the future, lost your job, somebody's sick, those are real things to be anxious about, right? And that's an adaptive response, right? You want to have a little bit more alertness so that you can deal with the event that's happening, right? So, but, to take a step back and say, oh, anxiety arising, depression is present. And that way, if you almost can like label it and identify it, it can allow you to kind of cognitively separate, oh, this is part of the anxiety response. This is part of, my experience of depression. I can be aware of that. I can acknowledge it. How do I make choices in my life that can still allow me to move forward and be supportive to myself as well as the people around me?
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like really acknowledging the different emotions that are present in the moment and then being able to pause and really ask what's called for right now.
Exactly. A job loss is the perfect example. That's incredibly stressful. And, a lot of research over the decades has really shown that, financial difficulties, losing one's job, that's one of the most stressful things that anyone can experience. Right. So just saying, oh, see a silver lining, everything is great. That's not adaptive and that's not true. You need to be able to say this is very difficult. I'm having a hard time, so that you can not react to the situation, but that you can respond, right? What do I need to do to move forward? What actions do I need to take to deal with this more effectively? How can I support the people around me who are also experiencing this distressing event, right? If someone loses their job, it affects them, it affects their entire family, often other people in the community may be affected. So, you need to be able to kind of recognize that stressor, acknowledge that it's difficult so that you can take the necessary action to deal with it as best you can, right? Whether that is through a proactive coping, there's something that you can do, right? Like looking for a supplemental job or, trying a new path, or whether the response is just, this is really hard and difficult and I need to do the best I can to regulate my emotions, and weather the storm until there's a better time ahead,
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, how does your personal practice, I know you're a mindfulness practitioner as well as teacher, how does your personal practice inform your research?
So it informs it a lot. And, over the years, I've kind of seen it come together even more. So I spent kind of the first big chunk of my career looking at how people respond to negative life events from a large scale perspective, right? So I've done a lot of studies looking at thousands of people and how they respond to these big events like the Boston Marathon bombings, earthquakes, hurricanes, shootings, and looking at how people as a whole respond to that. And then as my career progressed, I became really interested in, so what can we do to help people? What interventions are helpful for people? So one of my major projects right now is looking at how a mindfulness-based intervention, so it's an intervention that incorporates meditation, different types of body awareness activities and yoga, and how that can help regulate this physiological stress response, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression in a population who has experienced a lot of trauma. So, and this particular study looks at trauma-exposed homeless women. And so there's definitely this link between, I was kind of doing all of this personal work and meditation and yoga to regulate my own stress response, but it took me a few years before I was able to kind of take that piece of my life and really integrate it with all of this scientific work that I had been doing on responses to traumatic events.
That makes so much sense to me in that you had to embody the practices before you actually went out and started studying them in other populations.
Yeah, that was a really exciting project when I started it.
You talked about toxic positivity, and I think mindfulness is such a widely used term. It's sort of like, just be grateful, like just be more mindful. And I think the term mindfulness can even just sort of bring up a connotation of like, ugh, there's that word again. And so I'm curious, what you would say to that. And I guess just what you would say to that.
Yeah. So mindfulness, as John Kabat-Zinn, who's a researcher at a University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I think most long-term practitioners of sort of from that tradition, they would say, mindfulness is being aware of what is happening in the present moment as it unfolds. That might be positive, and that is oftentimes negative, right? So gratitude may arise in a moment of mindfulness, but you could also be aware of anxiety. You could be aware of depression. You could be aware of anger. You could be aware of grief, right? And all of those could be experiences that occur as well, right? And being able to tune in and be aware of those experiences allows one to respond appropriately. Why would you feel happy when someone you loved died? Then grief frequently will arise, right? And again, there's a lot of variability. So we don't even want to say that, someone experiences grief right in the aftermath of a loss. Like people have all different types of responses, like even to the same event, even to big major tragedies, right? So for that, for a lot of people that experience a loss, grief is present. Sadness is present, right? That allows a person to honor their experience and adjust and adapt accordingly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other side of the coin too, right? If you're so focused on the future or the past, your mind is going here, your mind is going there, then you do miss a beautiful moment, right? You miss that moment with a loved one, you miss that moment with your spouse or your child or walking the dog, right? So mindfulness, it's a gift in that it allows you to be present when beautiful moments arise in life. But, the other side of the coin is it also requires you to be present with life's difficulties. And that opens the door to healing. That opens the door to responding in a way that's helpful and beneficial. And being aware of one's habitual patterns that are not helpful, right? So, and you see it all the time. Like if you're not aware, I'm feeling anxious, people drink, people smoke, people overeat, people, binge on Netflix. And I'm not saying that any of those things, couldn't be a choice. They could. But the point is to put yourself in the driver's seat of how you're responding to life's challenges, so that you are able to make a choice. Maybe a choice is, what? I am so overwhelmed. I just want to lay on the couch and watch a movie today and then get up and take things on, tomorrow. But the point is to put yourself in the driver's seat and being able to make that choice, rather than just responding in a habitual pattern that may or may not be helpful.
Mm-hmm. So making those conscious choices.
Yeah.
And I think the piece that I want to just highlight again is that, there's a myriad of emotions and we all have different responses. Mm-hmm. I have a colleague whose wife passed away a few years ago from cancer, and he is a beautiful writer. And so he writes about his experiences as a form of healing. And he has a very vulnerable piece of writing that talks about even the relief that he experienced when his wife passed, and then the shame and the guilt that came with that sense of relief. And so I think it just speaks to, again, like this complexity of the human experience and the complexity, we may be experiencing multiple emotions at one time, and they could be layered upon one another.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point because, there's a lot of myths in society. There's, stages of grief. Everyone has to have the same experience. There hasn't been no scientific evidence of any kind that supported that, and what the science and the research has shown is that there is not one way that people respond to adversity. And there's not even necessarily one way that's more adaptive than the other in terms of the emotions that one can experience in the immediate aftermath, right? So even with something like the acute stress response, which is sort of like these early elements of post-traumatic stress disorder that people often experience in the immediate aftermath, for example, experiencing that constellation of symptoms is more highly associated with post-traumatic stress disorder later. However, many people experience acute stress in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event and do not go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So even within something like that, the science does show a link, we need to create the space that for some people, that response is normative and many will recover on their own, right? That being said, the other side of the coin is we don't want to say, oh, hey, people are distressed right away and then you'll be fine, right? We want to create the structures and the support that for people who are experiencing that protracted response over time, that there are resources to support them. Yeah. And, some people might experience adversity and not really have too much of a reaction either way. Some people feel numb. They don't feel happy. They don't feel sad. And sometimes that can, when you kind of think about it from like the scientific, like evolutionary perspective, a lot of those initial responses can be adaptive in different ways, right? So they, being aware that those can happen differently for different people and even at different times in one's life. You could think about, a divorce, for example, two people in the same marriage could decide to terminate this marriage. One person, like you were talking about with the gentleman who lost his wife to cancer, could experience like relief and freedom and even happiness. Other person could be experiencing grief more intensely than they ever have or will again in their life. Responding to that same event, that even same relationship could have two wildly different responses for two different people.
Well, and even I think for the gentleman that I was just talking about, it's day by day, right? So he'll talk about his grief journey, and one day it might be the person who's just in such difficult and extreme grief, and the next day maybe it's a sense of relief. So there's also this fluidity in the moment-to-moment experience.
Yeah, I think that's really important to acknowledge as well. Especially with grief. I mean, grief is kind of oftentimes people report it comes in waves. It comes, something reminds you of the event or the person. You're overwhelmed with grief. And sometimes you can experience that, grief arising even without a precipitating event or memory, just who knows where it comes from, so those types of experiences are certainly complex. And again, I think just from, a perspective of mindfulness, being able to be aware of those experiences, allows people to respond, because sometimes you can't go back to bed. Sometimes, grief arises, anxiety arises, depression arises, and you have to get the kids to school. You have to show up to work. Right. So you have to be able to acknowledge that that's what's happening. So you can take a step back, regulate, and take a step forward, even if it feels almost impossible to do so.
So, as you know, our audience really for this podcast are healthcare professionals and behavioral health professionals. What has your research found about healthcare workers and COVID-19?
Well, it certainly has been a stressful time for everybody, in society. There's been a lot of variability with healthcare workers as well. So it might depend on the hospital or the situation you work at. It might depend on how well your organization is preparing people, right? So if you're able to have the resources to care for the sick people who are coming in, you have the PPE, you have the beds, you're able to help people. People can feel good about being able to help people get better, right? That's why a lot of healthcare professionals, chose that industry, so when you're able to feel that sense of meaning and purpose and, achieving that goal of helping people, that those types of people and in those situations might even be responding better than someone who is at their house and not feeling connected to anyone at all. Right. So that could be an experience that arises, and then certainly, there's a lot of research on burnout and stress when healthcare workers are overwhelmed, they're not feeling the support from the community. I saw in the news, there was a walkout of healthcare professionals, because they were overwhelmed in their hospital of people who weren't getting the vaccine, and that they have had to deal with the, overcrowding, the overwhelm, the loss of patients. Certainly, we talk about in the ICU, the burnout and the post-traumatic stress that a lot of people that care for people in those situations experience, like you're human, you're a nurse, you just lost a patient. That's very difficult. Even, there isn't a lot of research that people necessarily like habituate to that, and, for many people, it can kind of become a cumulative exposure of loss. So again, even in those situations, I think there's like a lot of variability in how people respond and how people, and even in the situations people are in, right? So you could be in a community that's, highly vaccinated. You do get the occasional COVID patient trickling in and you feel good about being able to help them, right? Because you have the resources, both psychologically, emotionally, and then, the physical beds in the hospital to be able to help that person. And, a person could feel really good about that, in contrast to a situation where the hospital's overwhelmed, you're losing patients left and right. You feel some of these deaths or a lot of these deaths are preventable. So there's so much variability in even how healthcare workers respond. And I think it's really important to honor that as well.
Mm-hmm. That makes so much sense. We've talked with a number of healthcare providers, and we do hear a lot of variability in how people are experiencing the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And I just want to come back to, you've mentioned resources a couple of times. And one of the things that we find from all of the researchers that we're talking to about resilience is the importance of resources. In your experience, what do you see as some of the needed resources for healthcare providers right now?
Yeah, so I would say that, and I think the hospitals and the healthcare system has done, has been able to ramp up so that, in the beginning of the pandemic, people didn't even have PPE. So, I think at least society has been able to address that, to a large extent. It's been really hard in situations where they've had, shortages of nurses and doctors, because I think, for healthcare providers and for everyone, that time away to recover emotionally, psychologically, get sleep, do those kind of self-care activities like getting sleep, taking a walk, exercising, eating healthy, time with friends and family, those are things that rejuvenate people. I think it's really difficult when people are working in a situation where they don't have time to engage in those activities, because that can kind of lead to burnout as well. Certainly, we'd recommend that there be psychological resources available for hospital staff. There's been a lot of interest in doing, like things like mindfulness-based interventions for healthcare workers, so that, some of those kind of external circumstances cannot be changed. So in those situations, it's really important that people have those resources internally to be able to regulate the stress response so that they're able to do their job and care for other people.
Yeah, absolutely. I when you said self-care, I became aware of, we talked about toxic positivity and people's response to mindfulness. And I think the same is true for self-care right now. It's like, oh, but really what you're pointing to is the need to take care of our body, our physical body, our emotional body, even spiritually. And that, these basic practices of getting sleep, of eating nutritious or nourishing foods for your body, of taking time to downregulate the nervous system. Like these are just things that you need to do to function so that you can show up more effectively. But it's interesting, like I as I said, I get to talk with a lot of healthcare professionals, and you talk about self-care, and like I can just watch the walls go up. And so it's just an interesting insight.
Well, I think self-care can look different for different people, right? So even when I kind of mentioned earlier, like, eating or watching Netflix or, drinking, it's like, they're got this, I feel like there's been this one size fits all approach to like self-care. Who says taking a Saturday night and binge watching your favorite show on Netflix so that you can just check out, get, relax and then go to work? Then who says that's not self-care? Self-care doesn't have to just be another thing on your to-do list, like, baking bread and doing a yoga. Like if you don't like yoga, don't do yoga, and there's not a one size fits all approach. A lot of people find meditation helpful. Not everybody does. Don't do it. Find something else that services you. Maybe you love ice cream, and what is helpful for you is to take your family and go to your favorite ice cream shop and enjoy a delicious treat, and not feel guilty about it. Like who says that's not self-care? Self-care is also very individual, and again, that's where the mindfulness comes in. Self-care, having some ice cream, isn't mindlessly eating an entire pint of Ben and Jerry's, standing up in the kitchen, feeling guilty about it the whole time. That's not self-care. It's just another thing to beat yourself up and feel bad about. But, saying, hey, like, this is my favorite ice cream. I had a rough day. I need a treat, and I'm going to enjoy every single bite of it. Who says that's not self-care? I need to sleep in, and there's been a lot of talk about, you've kind of like this kind of perfectionism that, during, and I guess this probably doesn't relate to healthcare workers as much, that, make good use of your time during the pandemic. And people were feeling really guilty about it because they didn't want to do anything. They didn't want to organize their closets with their time off. They didn't want to start a new hobby. And so people were kind of feeling, guilty about that as well. But I think self-care can look a lot of different ways. And it's, again, that from my perspective of mindfulness, it would be like checking in with yourself and understanding what's helpful for me, so that looks really different for different people.
Thank you for naming that, because I think it's a really important piece of the conversation. And I love your example of like the mindless ice cream and then the mindful ice cream and the difference between the two.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I think the other piece, it sounds like, is giving yourself permission to do what's needed in that moment, right? If it's sleeping in that morning and you're able to, right? Giving yourself permission to, and not beating yourself up over it, or giving yourself permission to binge watch whatever TV show it is that you're loving, to give your mind a break. Because I think, in this time, it is really overwhelming for our brains, just based on how we're wired, on the amount of uncertainty that we're experiencing, especially as we are in this second wave of the pandemic. There is a lot of uncertainty and the impact of that on the brain.
Yeah. And again, mindfulness is being aware, right? So again, you can think of exercise as another example. Compulsively forcing yourself to go to spin at 5:30 in the morning when you don't get any sleep, how is that helpful? That's not helpful. Of course, exercise is good for the, research shows exercise is good for the, your emotion, your health, but, doing it in a way that is just punishing It's not helpful for your body. It's not helpful for your mind. That's just giving yourself another thing to be stressed out about, or, another thing to feel bad about when you don't make it, And so I think there's really like a balance between checking in and being able to say, like, what do I need? Or whether it's like, I have not moved my body all week, even though I'm tired, I have to get myself out of bed and make it to a workout, so it's like, it's not a one size fits all approach to every person. And it's not a one size fits all approach to every person every day. It's being able to kind of check in and like put yourself in the driver's seat of what you need to do for self-care for you in that moment.
I purchased myself a Peloton bike recently, and I get the bike and I'm like, okay, I'm going to get up every morning and get on the bike. So that's my plan, because that fits into the schedule of my day. And so like day one of this new schedule, I wake up and check it. I also practice mindfulness and check in, and my body's like, no. Like I get up, I meditate, I have a cup of coffee, I read, maybe journal, and moving at that time is not supportive for my body. And so I was like, oh, right. Like we try to fit it into our schedule, like based on what makes most like logistical sense. But checking in, for me, it's 2 or 3 in the afternoon is the ideal time to work out. And scheduling that is often a challenge. So it's that, checking in what makes sense today, what is called for, what's needed. Well, I want to thank you for your time. How can our audience learn more about your work or connect with you?
So they can learn more about my work. I have a couple websites. The first one is my mindfulness website is danarosegarfin.com. They can also email me at dgarfin@uci.edu. And then my professional website with all my research, that's actually linked. There's a link to that on danarosegarfin.com. So I recommend they reach out. I'd love to talk with anyone. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And we'll make sure that those links get in the show notes. And again, thank you for your time and sharing all of your research with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to CSAT Conversations, your resource for exploring behavioral health topics. We hope you found today's conversation timely and meaningful. Please share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. If you want to learn more, visit us at our blog at csatondemand.org.
CSAT Podcast Network. This podcast has been brought to you by the CSAT Podcast Network, located within the Center for the Application of Substance Abuse Technologies at the University of Nevada, Reno. For more podcasts, information, and resources, visit csat.org.